Thank you for coming in. In the weeks that this bill has been discussed and debated, it's clear that an overwhelming percentage of the American people, Democrats, independents, or Republican friends, have made it clear, the people out there, made it clear they strongly support the American Rescue Plan. Yesterday, with the final passage of the plan in the House of Representatives, their voices were heard and reflected in everything we have in this bill. And I believe this is, and most people I think do as well, this historic legislation is about rebuilding the backbone of this country and giving people in this nation, working people, middle-class folks, people who built the country, a fighting chance. That's what the essence of it is. And I'm going to have a lot more to say about that tonight and the next couple of days and be able to take your questions. But in the meantime, what I'm going to do is sign this bill and make a presentation tonight. And then there's going to be plenty of opportunities. We're going to be on the road not only talking about what I'm talking about tonight is the impact on the virus.
Joe Biden has come across something that he thinks was a mistake in the Obama era. He thinks, one, that the bill was too small during Obama's term, but two, on top of that, also that he didn't chest stump it enough. He didn't toot the own horn. He didn't toot how good the bill was. And so he has decided to basically do twice as much, I suppose, as the previous Obama bill, and also to basically toot his own horn. So these guys are going to be out there in campaign style, basically supporting the bill. I am not going to take anything from the bill in the way that the bill is specifically written. I don't have an issue with the items that are in the bill. I have an issue with what was not included in the bill. If you're going to make this talk here about workers, then you should have supported those workers with $15 an hour. And that is something that was left out of this bill. The New York Times has a piece up that is basically saying that the Democratic Party should take a victory lap. That the opinion of the editorial board of the New York Times is that Democrats should chest stomp. Yes! To spike the football! Spike the football with the Democratic Party. Problem. You could say that the $1.9 trillion is a victory as Joe Biden signs it. And that is what Democrats are going to be saying. By the same token, as Joe Biden signs that, I can also just as credibly say with absolute and entire certain honesty that that is also the death of the $15 an hour minimum wage promise. And that while the promise dies, they're going to be tooting the achievements of the $1.9 trillion stimulus and allowing, in an almost politically managed way, the fact that Biden fought on the notion of $15 an hour, that he gets in office and says he still is fighting for $15 an hour. And yet, the opportunity to get it passed, he'd let it all go by. He's going to pretend as if he's being held by some invisible strand. No. Joe Biden had the ability to ask Kamala Harris to get rid of or knock over the parliamentarian. He didn't do that. Joe Biden had the ability to put a foot in the ass of the Democrats that was stopping him and standing in his way. He didn't do that. He could have called him into his office and browbeat him to use the majesty of the presidency, or for that matter, scream at the bully pulpit that they're standing in the way of America's agenda. Because fact of the matter is, the American public dramatically backed this bill with the $15 an hour. And by the way, they're desperate, so they'll back it with this too. But let's just be very clear. When this sugar high goes away, those people are still going to be without $15 an hour. Those people are going to be still at that starvation wage. And I didn't call it that. You called it that. You called it a starvation wage when you were fighting Trump. And by the way, as you talk about COVID and you talk about the 500,000 to 520,000 people that died, poor people, the majority of which most likely was making under $15 an hour. They basically gave their lives working at those factories, working at those stores, so we can eat. You call them heroes. Heroes. And yet the ones that are left behind, that are still at those stores, that have stayed at those stores, the nurses, the technicians, the various people who make under the $15 an hour, you gave them a bill of goods. You can make an argument that the people who voted for Joe Biden in the House of Representatives did so just to get rid of Trump. Fair enough. I would say that an aspect of that they wanted, A, him to live up his word, which was $15 an hour, but B, on top of living up his word, it went beyond that to many of them would be directly affected, especially if we're talking about single mothers or single black mothers who have a higher propensity to be in poverty, or for that matter, Hispanic women who have a higher propensity to be in poverty. Those people would have been dramatically assisted by that $15 an hour minimum wage. Dramatically so. He threw them over the bus at the first hint of opposition, which makes me think you never meant it. And the politics, the theater that have taken place with the virtue signaling in the House, legislative virtue signaling by putting into a bill, knowing full well that the Senate was going to take it out and that you in no way were going to ever stand up for the $15 an hour, despite the fact that between the two various houses, you would be the House that would have more credibility on this, considering the President of the United States said he wanted it. He put that in that bill. He was the one who said he wanted the $15 an hour. So when it goes into the House and the House puts it into the bill and the Senate takes it out, who has more leeway in that? You have the House that says we want this. You said the Senate that says we don't. And you have the President that says we do. And the President is trying to set his agenda. And so you would think that if the President was serious about it, if the House was serious about it, it would be in the bill. But that's not what happened. When Warnock and Ossoff was getting elected, what did they say? Put us in office, you'll get your 2,000. Not only did they not get the 2,000, it was cut to 1,400, and that 1,400 was cut out of the hands of 17 million people. Back to that for a moment. But it was also to enact Joe Biden's agenda. That agenda supposedly was $15 an hour. I have a question. If it's a victory lap that these guys should be taking, what was the victory? More importantly, who was the victory over? Who were your opponents in this particular victory? Who were you fighting to even call it a victory in the first place? And should it be called a victory? I understand that they were able to pass the COVID bill. Congratulations. Good job. You got your COVID bill. But that's not what you told the American public. I would have more sympathy in this if you were fighting somebody in this. But the fact of the matter is your opposition is on acid or something. I mean, the Democratic Party has basically passed a $1.9 trillion COVID bill. And again, I take nothing from what's out the bill. I even applaud some of the aspects of that bill. I am making the point, though, that not everybody has kids. When this sugar high runs down, those people are still going to be making shit wages. And it was something that you had all the power in the world to change and refused to do so. Refused to do so. That's not a win. Who were you fighting? You weren't fighting the Republicans. The Republicans were talking about Dr. Seuss and basically talking about shit like this.
Even today, we heard about Biden's dog biting someone. Can you imagine if President Trump had a dog at the White House and it bit someone? The press would go crazy. They'd say this dog is working with Russia and we got to have an investigation. So I think the American.
So just to be clear, the Democratic Party is passing a $1.9 trillion stimulus that is going to have great beneficial effects to a lot of people in this country. But that's secondary. That's the opposition talking about Biden's dog and Dr. Seuss, meaning there is no opposition. The Democratic Party was arguing and fighting with the Democratic Party. And in the fights with the Democratic Party, the key thing that they end up taking out was basically the policy that would have been the most dramatic in regards to its assistance. You're talking about millions of people. And God forbid, I don't know if you've ever worked a minimum wage job. I've worked a minimum wage job. And I remember working all of those hours for seemingly nothing. The working poor. And it was right after I had a transplant. So it was in that situation where it was like you actually needed a job because your insurance at a certain point after a number of years were going to run out. You were on basically a clock on that front. I'm just making the point that I had a mom that basically lived under a $15 an hour wage and had to raise a kid on that. That is not a trivial fucking thing. If you're making $13 an hour, this legislation would have added, $2 an hour? And think about that over the course of a month. If you were making $10 an hour, that's $5 an hour a day extra. Those are not modest numbers, especially if you're one of those people that are in that, or one of the tens of millions of people that would have been affected by this. You were fighting with yourself. That's the honest to God truth. And what were you fighting with yourself over? Whether or not the American worker was worth $15 an hour. That was the fight. Was the American workers worth $15 an hour? And the answer that the Democratic Party came up with was no. Tell me I'm wrong. How can you tell me I'm wrong? They had the opportunity to do it. Biden had all the power in the world to do it. He could have used the bully pulpit. He could have pushed Manchin. He could have got rid of the parliamentarian in regards to stopping and blocking the pathway. He didn't do any of that. That's the point that I'm making. They were fighting basically themselves. Biden had carte blanche over whatever he wanted to do. He could have even got rid of the filibuster if he wanted. He could have pushed those guys to try to get rid of the filibuster in order to get his agenda passed. He chose not to do any of that. And because he chose not to do any of that, the policy that would have been one of the most dramatic in regards to reducing poverty in this country was just gutted. And the working poor on a starvation wage are going to remain so, because instead of the Democratic Party doing what it needed to do to ensure that that policy got over the finish line, they didn't do it. And they basically are now going to chest stump and use the theatrics and the sugar high off of being able to pass this legislation as a win. It's like, look at what we did, look at what we did, paying no attention to what we utterly, entirely lied to the American public on. And yeah, it was a lie. Because if you really wanted it in the bill, you could have put it in the bill. You had all the power to do it. You chose not to do it. All of that money spent on those wars, trillions of dollars, $7-8 trillion, all of those tax cuts that were given by Democratic and Republican presidents. If Hillary Clinton won that race, Hillary Clinton was also going to give a tax cut, just not as grotesque. All of this attentiveness to the moneyed interests, and yet when it came down to it, the American worker, whose productivity went through the roof and whose moneyed interests paid politicians to ensure that laws and policies and everything else worked in their interests, but more importantly, gave that money back in tax cuts. And they gave the moneyed interests whatever they wanted. When the economy hit the skids, they attended to Wall Street's needs like nobody's business, not necessarily to the American worker. They said moral hazard for Americans. Not so much for Wall Street. And yet, with all of those billions, tens, hundreds of billions of dollars that you gave to the money interests, when it came down to giving the working class, despite all the words and the rhetoric, you said he wasn't worth it. That's what this legislation says. When you sign that legislation, what you're signing is basically saying the American worker is not worth $15 an hour. Joe Biden, co-signed by all of the Democrats in the House and then in the Senate, that wouldn't necessarily pass that legislation. That's what I see in that. So when you say it's a victory lap for who? He had all the power in the world. The American public gave him that power to do it. The only thing he needed to do was live up to his agenda. That's it. That's when you get a victory. That's when it's called a win. If Joe Biden would have got here, and let's say, for sake of argument, he passed the COVID plan, and the only thing that was in the plan was $20 checks and a pair of Nikes for pretty much anybody, but he called it the COVID stimulus plan. Is that a win? My point is, it sets a precedent that things can be too modest to be considered a win. And at that point, we're just quibbling over a subjective context of what's a win versus not. If we're talking about FDR and what he did necessary for the Great Depression, and compare it to this was on a scale beyond the Great Depression. Compare it to this, and compare what he's doing with what FDR was doing. Compare the urgency in FDR's rhetoric and his stature as he went about trying to save America, save the world. He moved as if this country was under an alien invasion. Compare that to this. And you tell me that this is a win. The New York Times may think this is a win because they're in the ivory tower and they could work from home. They could be remote. They were part of that class that was beyond this stuff. And so, yeah, it may be great for you, but if you're making $11 an hour, it's not that great. That $1,400 is going to go to rent. 2 months at the most, 1 month most likely. Then you're back to where you started. Yes, you're going to get to $300 potentially. That's assuming you even have a job. And if you do have a job, well, how much are you making? How much would that $15 have helped? And Joe Biden and the Democrats, for some reason, supposed to get a victory lap, despite the fact that with all of the power that they needed to do what he said, a diminutive agenda at that, he told the American public you were going to do it. And now, because you're not going to get rid of the filibuster, you have no pathway to do it. Because you were not going to push the parliamentarian, you have no pathway to do it. Because you weren't willing to get your Democrats online to support your agenda. You were the one that got elected. And you weren't willing to get those guys in line to support your agenda. And because of that, it didn't pass. The House didn't mean it. The Senate was so mean-spirited that they held this bill up for another week, ripped food out of the mouths of babies and hungry mothers in order to put a knife in the American worker, to put it that much more clearly. The Democratic Party does not believe you're over $15 an hour, regardless of whatever the rhetoric. Experientially, we just saw that to be true. And yeah, that needs to burn. That needs to sit into the conscience of the American public. I don't down this bill and the fact that this bill was passed. I make the point that it's not a victory lap because they had all the power in the world to do it. I have no idea who it's a victory over. I have no idea who they were even fighting. The Republican Party was not even part of this conversation. It was just them. And they themselves chose, the Congress, they came together. They made a decision. And their decision was the American worker is not $15 an hour. And they just enshrined that shit into law. Like, share,